Hey English 106, Stephanie Letty here. Just wanted to come at you with a few notes on managing evidence and using source evidence. So first I want to just highlight a few key ideas from the Easy Writer and from the Research Writer. The Research Writer I know talks about limiting quotations. So to give you guys kind of just a concrete example, I would say 1 to 2 quotations per paragraph, probably max 2. If As you took a look at the sample lit review that was posted to Blackboard, you'll probably notice most of those paragraphs had either 1 or 2 pieces of quoted material as evidence. So limiting your paragraphs to maybe 1 to 2 quotes just ensures that you'll be able to really discuss them, really analyze them, helps you avoid that research log feel where you just sort of list 18 quotes one after another and never really talk about them, and it just kind of feels like a list more than an analysis. Remember, the evidence works for you. You don't work for the evidence. So use those quotes carefully and make them really work for you and work to support your points. The Research Writer and the Easy Writer both also mention block quotes a little bit in terms of formatting block quotes. So just kind of a note on those block quotes, which are the longer quotes that are in MLA style, 4 lines or more. In APA style, I think they say 50 words, but longer than about 4 lines. Which are indented from the margin and formatted a little differently. Limit yourself to probably 1 block quote. If your paper is closer to the 10 range, maybe 2, but you really don't want to use too many block quotes in your paper because they kind of start to overpower your own personal voice. So try and limit those big quotations to 1 or maybe 2 and really just focus on picking out sort of the key nugget of the quotation and using a shorter quotation whenever possible. The Research Writer and the Easy Writer both also mention ellipses, which are the ... marks. Just kind of a note on using these. As the textbooks say, you do use these ellipses if you use a quote and you cut something out of the middle of the quote. When you take something away from the middle of the quote and you use like the first part and the last part, but you cut out that middle, you put the ellipses, the ... in between. But just kind of a note there, you do not need to use ellipses at the start of the quote or at the end of the quote. So no need to put them anywhere other than if you take out something from the middle. And finally, the Research Writer includes a chart on page 194, which I believe they call attributive verbs, but it's a chart full of verbs and they're super helpful. And I think they're great for using in your signal phrases, great for using as you're kind of introducing your quotes, using your author's names, that kind of thing. So that chart is super helpful. You might want to take a look at it, consider using some of those quotes within your paper because I think they're really awesome. So next I just want to talk a little bit about using your evidence and really, like I said, making the evidence work for you instead of you working for the evidence. So kind of a good way to think about it is that each piece of evidence you use is like a little dot. So remember those old connect the dots pictures, right? And they're sort of like this. Come a little closer. Sort of like this, where you have all these dots and they're numbered, and your job was to kind of go around and follow the numbers and connect them. So every time you add a piece of evidence, that's like one of those little dots. And as you analyze your evidence, as you talk about it, as you discuss it, kind of show your readers how it supports your thesis, that is working to connect those dots. So if you properly analyze your evidence, you go from having just the dots to having a beautiful picture where the dots are all connected. And I know you're really marveling at my artistic skills, but that's sort of a wonky looking star now that the dots are all connected instead of just being a bunch of random dots on a page. So I think a good example of this, the sample lit review on Blackboard on page 6, the top paragraph on that page. So those writers arguing, they make a claim where they say Shapiro and Long lost strength in their article, and then there's sort of a dot where they say their delivery was vague, causing their ideas lose credibility, and they talk about that claim they've just made. And then they give a quote, and that's another dot where in the quote says some of what has been done no longer needs to be done, etc., and they give that quote. That's another dot. That's another piece of evidence. And after that quote, they say it's a perfect example of how their ideas were vaguely presented, creating much confusion. So they've analyzed that quote, which draws sort of a line to connect that dot to the next dot. And then they make a claim where they say readers may understand librarians need to not fear technology but become completely lost in translation that follows. That's another dot, another claim. And then they analyze that claim. They discuss it a little bit, and they say, as a result, their claims are drastically weakened. Furthermore, the article is outdated, which lessened credibility even more. So as they discuss that claim they made, or analyze that claim they made, that's another line connecting those dots. So we go from dots on a page to our beautiful picture. So really work on doing that. Really work on connecting the dots for your readers so they can kind of follow your ideas, trace the pattern instead of having to go, I don't know, what order these dots go in? And then they get a little lost. One way to really do that is make sure you're explaining why all your quotes are significant. So kind of a good example of where this is done in the Lit Review. If you take a look on page 9 towards the bottom of the page, that last paragraph, the writer uses a quote from their Murdoch source. And the quote is, libraries are providing innovative artistic events and after-school programs, as well as creating architecturally pleasing, Wi-Fi ready places where people want to bring their laptop computers and work in the company of others. And so they give that evidence, and then they really do a great job of explaining why it's a significant piece of quoted evidence. So the writer says, in this statement, Murdoch disclosed how libraries were becoming more socially pleasing, modern spaces in order to fulfill the demands of the public and increase usage. This statement also effectively supported Murdoch's thesis of modernizing the library by providing very specific examples of what libraries were offering. And so the writer has slowed down and taken the time to talk to readers about here's what the quote says and here's how this is sort of important to my overall analytical viewpoint in my Lit Review, significant to kind of what I've been talking about. And so really make sure to help your readers connect those dots, you take that time and you talk about why the quotes are significant, and just instead of just kind of being like, here's a quote, next. Here's a quote, next. It's not super helpful. So really explain those quotes. Another tactic you can use, so we talked about how for your Lit Review you'll need to summarize your source and give an analysis. Well, you don't necessarily have to think about it like we have the Berlin Wall and we have summary on this side and analysis on the other, right? This is a Mr. Gorbachev tear down the wall situation where you can really intersperse your analysis and your summary. So this is sort of also known as don't let your summary take over. Make sure your analysis is what is foregrounded and the summary is kind of just there so readers know what's going on with the article. So I think a really good place where this is done in the sample Lit Review, if you take a look on the bottom of page 5, which is where the writer transitions into their second source. So they start out by making a claim where they say, unlike Carlson's article, Shapiro and Kevin Brooke Long's article was a bit more shaky. So they make that claim that it was a bit more shaky. That's sort of an analysis. They're giving their opinion of the article. And then they have about 4 sentences of summary where they say this article focused on improving user services. They claim that implementing and enhancing services was key to improvement, blah, blah, blah. And so it summarizes the article for about 4 sentences, 3 to 4 sentences, just kind of giving us the overall main points. And then the paragraph ends with another claim where they say, although Shapiro and Long presented valid ideas for library renovation, the delivery of their ideas was somewhat hazy. So this paragraph includes both analysis and summary. The writer has made a couple of claims. They've summarized the article so readers know where they're coming from, but they've really set themselves up that the summary was just enough. It wasn't too long. It was just enough for readers to kind of get a general idea of the article. And they've given us a little analysis so that as they move into their full analysis on page 6, the reader's ready for it. We haven't had pages and pages and pages of summary, and then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, we're going to talk about the article. So think about the fact that you can do both summary and analysis together, where you can kind of make a claim, outline the article, make another claim, and then move into a further analysis. Don't be afraid to do that. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about how your evidence can really be effectively used in synthesis, which is where we talk about a couple of articles in relation to each other. So a good thing to do is to point out similarities. An example of this would be on page 10 of your sample lit review. So the kind of the full paragraph in the middle of that page, the author talks about Murdoch and Carlson. So they say that, for instance, Murdoch explained several times the library has changed with the addition of non-library services as a result of needing to differentiate from the internet, which was exactly the change that Carlson had predicted 7 years earlier. So that does a really good job of pointing out how Murdoch and Carlson in their two articles had a similar viewpoint, even though they were written at different periods in time. But what do you do if people aren't agreeing? What do you do if you have some sources that don't agree? Well, you can point out disagreement and kind of show where maybe not everyone that's thinking about this idea is thinking about it in the same way. So a good example of that, if you look on page 8 of the sample lit review, the very bottom of the page, we have just the start of a paragraph. The writer says, along with the various authors in this review, Gayton agreed libraries have to do something to get students in the door. However, this something proved to be very different in Gayton's mind. So pointing out that the Gayton source doesn't necessarily agree with everyone else. And then they kind of go on to say on page 9, at the top of page 9, if you flip the page, overall, Gayton provides insight of why everyone is not necessarily in favor of a social change in library, which contrasts authors such as James Murdoch, who are in fact in favor of socialization of the library. So pointing out that there is a contrast, there is a difference. And that's okay to do in your synthesis, because not everyone agrees all the time, even though they may think about the same topic, they may kind of have some of the same ideas. They don't have to agree on everything, and that's a great thing to point out as you're synthesizing articles. You can also synthesize more than one article. You may have 2 or 3 or 4 articles that are kind of agreeing on the same thing. So there's a great way, and there's a great example of how to do this on page 12, the paragraph at the top of page 12, where the writer is talking about Nelson and Nelson's article. So at the very end of that first paragraph on page 12, the writer says, in essence, Nelson suggested combining the ideas of both Gayton and Murdoch. So showing how Nelson relates to two authors and how this Nelson source can bring together two of the other sources and synthesizing all 3 of them. So don't be afraid also to talk about 3 or 4 articles in relation to each other if they're kind of all doing the same thing, or if they're one article kind of bridges the gap between 2 other ones. So you can definitely talk about all those together. And finally, with synthesis, you can also, like with summary, you can bring together a little bit of analysis in with your synthesis. So a really good example of this is on page 10, again talking about Gayton and Murdoch, those 2 sources, right in the middle of the page. So here on page 10, the author points out that it is especially unique that both Gayton and Murdoch published their articles in the same year of 2008, thus showing how controversial the library situation has been. So what that does is it brings together these 2 sources, kind of says, oh look, they're both done at the same time, and gives a little analysis of that, discusses it a little bit, talks about how these 2 articles and the fact that they're published in the same year is a little different, it's a little unique, and how that kind of shows us something about their overall topic. So you can use your synthesis as you're talking about the different articles together to kind of contribute to your analysis, and that's a totally okay thing to do and can be pretty helpful. Finally, the last thing I want to look at a little bit is kind of how the conclusion functions with this essay. I know the conclusion for this, you might kind of be wondering, well, how do I wrap up this lit review? How do I sort of wrap up with all these articles? So what this author does is, and this is on page 13 and 14 of the sample is where we conclude. So they kind of remind us of the main idea of the thesis, where they say that the articles review varying opinions of how the library is to be rejuvenated in order to attract users who favor a laptop over a library. kind of remind us of that central idea, that central claim from the thesis. And then they go on for a couple sentences and they kind of summarize in general, tying together the points. Over the years, library seems to have less importance. This has caused libraries to slump into desperation to try and get us through the door. So kind of pulling together, here's the main kind of situation, here's what we've got going on. And then they nod to their articles where they kind of sum up all the articles together, where they say there's no real consensus. Some authors, such as Gayton, support this. Others, such as Murdoch, Nelson, and Carlson, realize this. Even this other article, Raleigh for Modern Improvement. So they kind of tie together all 6 of the articles and say, okay, in relation to the topic, here's how they all fit, wrapping them all up together. And then finally we end with kind of a concluding sort of so what statement where they say, as demonstrated in this review, library renovation remains a controversial topic as some hold on to traditional values while others push for modern innovation in saving library. So a great statement, sums everything up. Overall, all the articles, kind of summing it all up, bringing it together. So I think you guys could really look to this conclusion of the sample lit review as a good example. How do I wrap this thing up? This is a good example. Read through that, maybe take that as your model, and I think that'll really help you have some success. So now the moment you've all been waiting for. What's your assignment for Friday, your attendance assignment? So what I'd like you guys to practice for in lieu of class or as our sort of online class for Friday is to practice drawing connections between sources. So what I would like for you guys to do is take all your 6 sources, list your 6 sources, make sure you give the author and the title so we know what's what, and for each source in your list, connect it to at least one other source, if not more. So, for example, let's say you have Smith as a source. So Smith's article connects to Jones's article because they both feel that we should use cell phones in the classroom. And so make sure that you give us that why. What's that connection? What piece of info is sort of the connection that is either a point of agreement or a point of disagreement? So maybe Smith thinks that we should use cell phones in the classroom so students can look up information easily, whereas Jones thinks we should use cell phones in the classroom so that students have access to educational apps. Okay, so kind of pointing out exactly how they're connected and exactly how they relate to each other. Again, whether that's an agreement or a disagreement, show us that connection. And you can either do that in a Word document and attach that to your email, or you can type it directly into the body of an email. But either way, make sure that an email with your 6 sources and the way that each of those 6 sources connects to at least one other source lands in my email inbox by midnight on Sunday. That will, once that lands in my inbox, then you'll get your check mark that you were in class on Friday. All will be good. And don't forget about your homework for Monday, which is listed in the syllabus, but it's a couple pages of reading in the research writer about introduction, page 182 to 184, and also bring your laptop and your sources to class on Monday, as we'll be doing some drafting in class. So if you guys have any questions, shoot me an email or text or whatever. You guys know how to get a hold of me, and I will see you all on Monday.